Folklore is born out of fear. Most of the stories come from the Dark Ages, where plagues killed entire villages and a single change in weather could condemn you to months of hunger. To make sense of so much pain and so much suffering, people came up with stories of witches who put curses upon your family and fairy folk who stole your baby. In the Netherlands and Belgium, there were whispers of demons who rode goats through the night sky, robbing any house and church they came upon. Even though witches and fairies have, for most people, faded into the back pages of history as nothing more than fairy tales, I can assure you, the Buckriders were quite real. Hello and welcome to episode 24 of Certainly Strange. Today is yet another delve into folklore, and to be honest, these types of episodes are my favourite ones to do. I think it's just really interesting to see how folklore from whatever time period still manages to influence life even today. I mean, you can still see how folklore such as witches and ghosts and bad luck of black cats is still very popular today. And the story in this episode of the Buckriders is the story where folklore and real life has blended together to a point where no one is exactly sure what is what. The Buckriders are a part of Dutch and Belgian folklore and history that is really interesting. They are celebrated as folk heroes today, but the truth behind the tales are truly quite bloody. So let's just get into it. In the 18th century, in the period around 1740 to 1800, the south of the Netherlands, as well as Belgium and a small western part of Germany, was plagued by a gang of robbers who called themselves the Buckriders. The Buckriders, according to folklore, were demons or people who had made a pact with the devil, who rode through the night sky on winged goats to do the devil's bidding. The riding or even worship of a goat has been associated with the worship of the devil for centuries, and those who worship the devil could make the goats fly by speaking the words across houses, across gardens, across stakes and even across Cologne into the wine cellar. According to the stories, these Buckriders would fly to the Moorheide forest, a forest just south of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, to dance with the devil, very similar to the witches' Sabbath. The name Buckrider first appeared in a letter written by one Johan van Muysen, in which he threatened a farmer called Wouters, telling him that he and his gang, the Buckriders, would burn his farm to the ground if he did not pay them money. It is very likely that this gang of robbers used the name of Buckriders to strike fear into the hearts of the people and, of course, their potential victims. And the people were quite right to be afraid of them. A group of armed robbers, often counting from 8 to 10 men, would travel to farms or rectories in the night, where they would overpower anyone who was inside. To, encourage the victims to tell them where their valuables lay hidden, the Buckriders would threaten their victims with the most horrible things, after which they would torture them. In their tortures, the Buckriders would burn the faces of their victims, burn the soles of their feet, and even sometimes burn their private parts. Other times they would tie the hands and feet of their victims and throw them down the staircase into the cellar, where they would be found the next morning. From these horrible efforts came quite a handsome reward. Money, clothing and other valuables would be packed into sacks and taken away. The price was high, however, sometimes even paid with a life. In 1737, one of the gangs of robbers who claimed the name of Buckriders killed a priest. Yes, no one was safe. People, especially farmers who lived in the middle of nowhere, were helpless against the brutal Buckriders. I mean, imagine that, living in a small community pestered by a gang of thieves that claimed to be the servants of the devil himself. It is no wonder that the authorities, when they started to take measures against these vile thieves, that they were as relentless as the robbers themselves. But the only trouble was, when did you know that someone was a Buckrider? After all, their faces were always concealed when they were robbing someone, sometimes even painting their entire faces black. Well, according to the justice system, one was a Buckrider, quite the same as someone could be a witch. After all, they belonged to the same group of ungodly people, along with witches and heretics, and they deserved the same trial and punishment. And by trial, I mean torture. All that had to happen is someone had to whisper that perhaps this and this person was a Buckrider, or a rumour had to start that a neighbour saw you flying through the night sky on a goat, and you would be arrested and tortured, forcing you to confess any of your fellow gang members. This method of identifying Buckriders have led historians to believe that most of those convicted were, in fact, not Buckriders at all. And so, innocent people died whilst the real robbers most likely got away with their crimes. Those who were convicted were brutally executed, either by breaking on the wheel, quartering, strangulation, decapitation, or, most often, they were hanged. Often, those under the suspicion that they were Buckriders were forced into confession through excessive and gruesome torture. Oftentimes, these confessions were far removed from actual truth, by people claiming that they had robbed more houses in the area than there had actually been robbings. A confession from a Buckrider resulted in much more than just his execution, however. Through it, entire families were destroyed, banished, and forced into poverty. In one instance, there was a family named Arets. In 1743, the mother, Mergen Arets, father, Michiel Arets, son Servaas and son-in-law Dirks were all arrested because the father, Michiel, was suspected to be a Buckrider, and because the daughter of the family, Christine, had died earlier during an abortion that had gone wrong. Because Michiel was convicted as a Buckrider, the entire family was executed. Here follows a description of their execution, and just a small warning beforehand, it is quite gruesome. I usually don't say this, but I was actually quite shocked to read this paragraph, so I just want you to know that if you are currently eating something, just pause this podcast and finish your meal and come back to it when you're finished. The family Arets was heavily blamed for possible child murder. Michiel Arets and his son Servaas were first half strangled and burned, after which they were decapitated. Their body parts were put on display on a spinning wheel. The only woman, Mergen Arets, was punished first by hacking off one of her hands, after which she was strangled and decapitated. Her body, too, was put on display on the wheel. The son-in-law, Dirks, was seen as the one responsible for the murder. His right hand was burnt and then hacked off, and a burning set of tweezers was used to cut off one of his nipples. After this, he was decapitated and placed upon the breaking wheel. In one instance, one of the convicted Buckriders, named Nijs Nijsten, had died in jail, and his corpse was still hanged at the gallows. Sometimes, however, the conviction did not result in death. Some of the people convicted as Buckriders were simply banished or managed to escape before they were executed. The last recorded execution of a Buckrider, a man named Cross-eyed Henske, took place on the 6th of May, 1777. In total, 468 men were convicted as Buckriders, many of whom were executed. The gruesome executions of so many, mostly innocent men, and the prejudices their families faced even generations later, has caused Valkenburg, the city where most Buckriders were tried and executed, to dedicate a monument to the victims of the trials and the mistakes that were made in the conviction of these victims. Though the history and the folklore of the Buckriders is gruesome and filled with death, the Buckriders have gained an almost Robin Hood-like status, inspiring paintings, music, books, comics and TV series. There is even a festival held in their name each year in Valkenburg, where you can enjoy a special brewed buckbeer, and you can enjoy music, a special market with local produce and other cultural events. But what I find so strange is, so first of all, you hear a lot about witch trials. I think that is one of the most popular things that has happened in history. There are hundreds and hundreds of books, TV series, movies, podcasts just dedicated simply to that topic. But witches weren't the only ones who were executed. So folklore has been used as an excuse to execute so many people, not only witches, but there's also been instances, I believe the biggest example of that being in Germany, where people were executed because people thought that they were werewolves. So you have witches and werewolves being executed, and then you also have this instance in Belgium and the Netherlands where Buckriders were executed, and it was simply because people were so afraid. And then you read like what happened. First of all, the robberies themselves, it was extremely gruesome. Like, people were burned, they were thrown downstairs, they were so afraid. It's not even comparable to like home invasions today, because people thought that it were like the servants of the devil who came to their house and came to hurt them. So you can't even begin to imagine the fear that they must have felt. And then you had the executions, the torture, the gruesome executions themselves, which I have partially described to you. And then, unbelievably, they have this Robin Hood-like status now. And the city Valkenburg, where most Buckriders or people who were convicted as Buckriders have died, and they are just like, you know what? We're going to make a festival about this. People are going to drink beer and listen to music and have a lot of fun. Imagine, I would be fuming if I was someone who got executed at Valkenburg after extensive torture and having the most gruesome of executions, and then just living there as a ghost and just watching people, I don't know, celebrate the fact that happened, celebrate the people who were responsible for the fact that you died. Unbelievable. But yeah, there's just an instance where I'm just, when I read about it, it was like, oh my god, I've never actually looked into this. I'm from the Netherlands myself, and I had heard about the Buckriders. There's like this theme park right in the Efteling, which is a theme park, and also like you have this comic book from a very popular Belgian comic characters about the Buckriders, and it's always like, oh my god, it's a bit spooky, but you know, it's fun because it's like folklore. And then you read about it and you're like, oh my god, this was actually horrible. I can't even imagine what it must have been like living in that time, living in the 18th century, and having to go through all of that first, being super afraid for being robbed. You know, home invasions are the creepiest things, one of the creepiest things that I can imagine happen to you. And then being convicted as a Buckrider, being tortured, being executed, and then people celebrating, you know, the very people who were responsible for that amount of fear being put into a community. And maybe I'm just being very prejudiced about, you know, the fact that it is a festival. Maybe it's really helpful for forcing the next generation to remember the Buckriders and what happened. But yes, that was the story of the Buckriders. One of my favorite episodes to research, actually, because I was just constantly like, oh my god, I didn't know this, because the region where this happened is actually quite close to where I live. So I was like, oh my god, I didn't know this. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to this episode of Certainly Strange. And not just this episode, but thank you for listening to Certainly Strange this entire year. I hope that you had a nice Christmas if you did celebrate that. Otherwise, I hope that you just had very nice days and other holidays. And a happy new year in advance. please consider leaving behind a review on Spotify and following us on Instagram at Certainly Strange the podcast. Everything about the podcast can be found on the website certainlystrange.com, where you can find the transcript of this episode as well as the sources that I used in my research. Small warning about the sources, most of them are in Dutch. So if you want to research, maybe just throw it into Google Translate or message me for translations of certain web pages. I'm completely fine for if you want translations for certain Dutch texts, if you are interested in this topic. And once again, thank you for listening. See you next year. Bye.